The Federation's first moon research colony, Selene 1, was supposed to be the future of humanity, proof that we could build and thrive off-world. It was hailed as the pinnacle of human ingenuity, but then the signals stopped. A garbled distress call was the last we heard from them, almost a year ago. All attempts at communication had failed, and the Federation had written it off as an unfortunate incident. But rumors lingered, talk of dangerous discoveries, of something the scientists shouldn't have unearthed. When the rescue mission was finally green-lit, they needed people who could keep their mouths shut. People like me. I was ex-military, now working search and rescue contracts. The money was good, though the briefing was thin. Selene 1 had suffered complications. That was all they'd tell us. The crew, the situation, even the layout of the colony. Sketchy at best. My team and I would be the first to set foot there in a year. I'd like to think we were prepared for anything. But what we found? No one could have prepared for that. We landed just beyond the colony perimeter, the silver-grey lunar dust swirling in the thin atmosphere stirred up by our thrusters. The Selene 1 dome loomed ahead, massive and cracked in places like a glass egg dropped on concrete. There was no welcome party, not even automated systems, just silence. Our commander, Ruiz, took point. "Remember," he said, his voice filtered through the comms, "we're here to assess and extract. Don't touch anything you don't need to." The airlock hissed as it opened. The stale metallic scent of decay hit us immediately, even through the filters in our suits. The lights inside were dim, flickering sporadically. Whatever had happened here, power was barely holding on. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The colony was eerily intact. No signs of external damage, but everything felt wrong. Tools lay abandoned mid-task. Food trays sat untouched. Contents rotted to mush. And then we found them. They weren't bodies, not anymore. Piles of skin, hair and clothing slumped where people had once been. Some were still sitting upright, their helmets clasped in skeletal hands. At first I thought they'd decomposed, but there was no smell of rot beyond the sour metallic tang. It was more like they'd collapsed inward. Ruiz knelt by one of the piles, his gloved hand trembling as he pointed. "It's like everything inside is gone. No organs, no blood, just husks. Hundreds of them." By the time we reached the central hub, the team was shaken. Wilkes, our engineer, kept muttering, "This isn't natural, this isn't right," under his breath. Ruiz barked at him to focus, but I couldn't blame the guy. I was barely holding it together myself. The central hub was where the distress beacon had originated, though it had gone silent months ago. The console was cracked, the screen dark, but Wilkes managed to pull a partial log. As he worked, the room seemed to grow colder, though our suit readings showed no temperature change. "This is Dr. Holden, lead researcher," a recorded voice crackled over the speakers. The message was fragmented, static, eating away at every third word. "We made a mistake. Something buried. Too deep. It took them. All of them. Do not approach. Do not..." The audio cut out. "What the hell does that mean?" Ruiz demanded, but none of us had answers. And then the shadows moved. At first I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, a trick of the flickering lights. But then I saw Wilkes freeze, his eyes wide behind his visor. Did anyone else see? The darkness in the corner of the room rippled, pooling and spreading like ink in water. It wasn't a shadow cast by anything. It was its own thing, moving with purpose. And then it took form. I can barely describe it. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and its body seemed to shimmer as if it were made of liquid. Where its face should have been, there was just a void, a deep blackness that felt like it was looking back at me. Wilkes screamed. The thing lunged. Chaos erupted. Wilkes's suit alarms blared as his oxygen levels plummeted. The creature had touched him. Just a brush of its hand and his visor cracked, the material corroding as if eaten by acid. He crumpled, convulsing. Ruiz shouted for us to retreat, firing his plasma cutter at the thing, but the bolts disappeared into it, as if swallowed. I grabbed Wilkes, dragging him back toward the exit. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was already starting to collapse like the husks we'd found earlier. "Help me!" I shouted. But Ruiz was backing away, his gun still trained on the creature. It didn't follow us, it just stood there, its featureless face tilting slightly as if curious. As we stumbled out of the hub, alarms started blaring, first a low drone, then a rising wail. Emergency lights flashed red, and a voice crackled over the intercom, automated and emotionless. "Containment breach. Initiate lockdown." We barely made it back to the lander. Ruiz was the last in, slamming the hatch shut just as the airlock seals began to hiss. We didn't stop to look back. The engines roared, and the colony grew smaller as we ascended. Wilkes didn't survive the trip. By the time we reached orbit, his body had crumpled in on itself completely, leaving only his empty suit. Ruiz and I sat in stunned silence, too shaken to speak. When we finally hailed the Federation, they ordered us to dock at a quarantine station. No explanations, no condolences. Before we were taken into isolation, Ruiz grabbed my arm. "That thing," he said, his voice trembling. "It let us go. Why?" I didn't have an answer, but as I sit here now, weeks later, staring out at the moon through the station window, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't survivors. We were messengers, and whatever it was, it's not done with us yet. I've been trying to convince myself that it's over, that whatever killed the researchers on Selene 1 was left behind, buried in the dark corners of that cursed moon base. But deep down, I know better. Something followed us. After the quarantine, the Federation released me. No ceremony, no thanks for my service. Just a clinical, "You're cleared to return to duty." They confiscated every piece of equipment we brought back. Wilkes' empty suit, gone. Ruiz? They moved him to a classified location. I haven't seen him since, but they didn't confiscate the memories or the nightmares. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollowed-out husks and that thing in the shadows, its formless face tilted like it was watching. The sound of Wilkes' last breaths haunted me, the awful hollowing sound of his body collapsing. The Federation tried to write it all off. Psychological stress, they called it. Anomalous lunar phenomenon. They said I was lucky to be alive. Lucky? No, I was cursed. It started small, flickers in my peripheral vision, shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. At first I thought it was just paranoia. After all, Selene 1 had shattered my nerves. But then things started disappearing. The first was a glass from my kitchen. I'd set it on the counter, turned to grab a towel, and when I looked back, it was gone. No crash, no trace. Just gone. The next was my flashlight, the one I kept on my nightstand. One night it was there, the next morning it wasn't. Then came the sounds, faint, barely there at first. A low, droning hum, like a power line vibrating just out of earshot. Sometimes it was a whisper, a soft, incomprehensible murmur in the dead of night. I scoured my apartment, tearing apart the walls, convinced I was losing my mind. But I found nothing. Until the night I found it. I had woken to the sound of static. It wasn't from the television or the radio. It was deeper, more resonant. It felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. The shadow. It was in the corner of my room, a dense, shifting pool of darkness that moved like liquid. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same as what I'd seen on Selene 1. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. The shadow stretched upward, taking on a shape, a tall, spindly figure with unnaturally long limbs. Its head tilted as it stepped closer, and I saw those same terrifying details. The way its form shimmered, as if made of living ink, and that awful void where its face should have been. It stopped at the foot of my bed. The static grew louder, filling my ears, my head, my soul. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. And then it spoke. Not in words, not in sounds. It was a pressure, a presence in my mind. I can't describe what it said, only the feeling it left behind. Utter despair. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I thought that would be the worst of it. I was wrong. The next day I noticed the first signs. My reflection in the mirror wasn't right. My skin looked duller, paler. There were faint, dark veins running beneath the surface. And my eyes, God, my eyes. The pupils looked smaller, as if the light was draining out of them. I went to a doctor, but they found nothing wrong. Stress, they said. Residual trauma. They handed me a prescription and sent me on my way. But I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it had marked me. I could feel it, like a cold weight in the pit of my stomach spreading through my body. The real breaking point came 3 days later. I was walking home late at night when I felt it again. That static hum, growing louder with every step. The streetlights flickered and dimmed as I passed, plunging the sidewalk into near darkness. I stopped, looking around, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shadows beneath the streetlights began to ripple. They stretched and twisted, pooling together in the center of the road. My chest tightened as the shape emerged. Tall, spindly, faceless. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds. They spilled out of the darkness, climbing the walls, slithering across the pavement, their formless bodies shimmering in the faint light. They didn't move toward me, they just stood there, surrounding me, watching without eyes. And then, as if on cue, they all tilted their heads in unison. I ran. I've been running ever since, and I don't sleep anymore. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, they're there, waiting. I've stopped using mirrors. The last time I looked, my face was barely recognizable. My skin has grown pale and thin, veins spreading like cracks in porcelain. I don't know what they did to me or what they want, but I do know this. It's not over. Whatever followed us from Selene 1 isn't just here to haunt me. It's growing, spreading, and I think I'm becoming one of them. If you're reading this, stay away from Selene 1. Stay away from the shadows. Stay away from the places the Federation refuses to talk about. It's not just on the moon anymore, and it's here. And it's growing.